Welcome to the Biology 182 lecture in the classification series over cladistics. At the end of this video, students should be able to explain ancestral versus derived versus shared characteristics and understand how evolutionary relationships are depicted in cladistics. Cladistics is a branch of science that studies taxonomy or classification of organisms. Classifying organisms in cladistics uses cladograms, and we use these cladograms to identify morphological similarities between organisms. These shared characteristics are assumed to be an evolutionary trend. The further along the evolutionary line and the more closely two organisms are related, the more shared morphological characteristics they would have in common. This is one way we look at evolutionary relationships. The idea from the left side is the ancestral species. Toward the right side would be the more modern species. The cladogram is the tree, also called a phylogenetic tree, which we see here. You can see that the bird and the crocodile are closely related as compared to the bird and the lizard, because they share common ancestry, more so than the lizard with the bird or crocodile. You can see that these separate traits will arise to differentiate the organisms based on their phenotypic characteristics or morphology. These cladograms demonstrate evolutionary change as well as divergence from common ancestors, and that develops the evolutionary relatedness. Now remember, these trees show this evolutionary lineage in a hypothetical way. And we use the KISS principle, where we keep it simple in order to be able to identify the most likely path in evolutionary terms. The node is a common ancestor. If you look at the root node, this is showing that the most common related organism of the baboon, chimpanzee, human, and gorilla was at the root. Node A is the common ancestor between the baboon, chimp, human, and gorilla. Node B is a common ancestor between the chimp, human, and gorilla. Node C, the common ancestor between the human and the gorilla. These nodes simply note a common ancestor. A clade is a common ancestor and all of its descendants that are being looked at in one area. So the common ancestor at the very, very tip of the triangle would be the most common ancestor between the giraffe, bat, turtle, crocodile, stegosaurus, tyrannosaurus, velociraptor, and hawk. Now, if you look at the pink triangle, that common ancestor would only be between the crocodile, stegosaurus, tyrannosaurus, velociraptor, and hawk. This is known as a clade. A clade would be the common ancestor and its descendants. When looking at species that are the end of the tree branches, we refer to them as taxa or a taxon. So each species or organism in its evolutionary context with other species is at the end a taxa or taxon. The common ancestor of A and B would be this square, right? The common ancestor that gave rise to both species A and species B is the square. The common ancestor between the taxon A, B, and C is where that original branch is coming down from the bottom of the screen. So in the case of taxon A and B, we have sister taxa. If A is a parent, B is its sibling or your aunt. If the common ancestor in A and B was the parent, then A and B are siblings and they're the offspring. So when we look at this cladogram or phylogenetic tree, we see a dog and a wolf, a coyote and a dhole. When we see these, we have common ancestor, we can see a clade, we can see sister taxa, and other taxa, right? So where is A, the sister taxa? The sister taxa exists between the dog and the wolf. They are sister taxa because they have one common ancestor between the two of them. They were derived from one common ancestor. The common ancestor B would be seen as the circles or square. Any of those would be common ancestors. The first circle to the right would be the ancestor of the dog and the wolf. The circle in the middle would be the ancestor to the coyote as well as the common ancestor of the dog and the wolf. And the square common ancestor would branch between the common ancestor that led to the coyote and the one leading to the wolf and the dog, as well as the one leading to the dhole. The clade could be either the first common ancestor to the right with the dog and wolf, or another clade could be the second middle common ancestor with the coyote, wolf, and dog, or the largest or the furthest back common ancestor would be the square, and that would include all four taxa. Each clade is also known as a monophyletic group. When we look at organisms in phylogenetics or in cladistics, we look for morphology, and the morphological traits are called characters. The primitive or ancestral character is one that all members in the clade have. So then we have derived characters, and those arise, they're not first, but they come in novel or new ways. And then there are shared derived characters, and those are shared between organisms or taxa, but do not include all taxa or all organisms because they do not have the ancestral organisms in there as well. So you could have shared taxa between mammals and turtles that arise, or shared traits. You could have a derived trait between crocodiles and birds, but derived just means one organism came from it. Shared derived is more than one taxa came from it. When we look at shared derived characters, they are called synapomorphies. So the common ancestor does not have the shared derived character because it would have the ancestral or the primitive derived characters, right? Or the characters. So all of the descendants of a common ancestor will have the shared derived characteristics or the synapomorphies. So if you look at the amniotic egg arising, you can see the amniotic egg arose and that common ancestor at the vertex under the amniotic egg line, along with the turtle, kangaroo, mouse, and human taxa, all share that amniotic egg synapomorphy. So the frog and the cichlid and whatever that primordial or primitive common ancestor would have been would not have the amniotic egg. The next idea is analogous or convergent evolution traits. And so these are homoplasy. And these arrive separately, not within the same clade. Now, if you look from the original ancestral common ancestor, you will see that a bat and a hawk are in that same monophyletic group. However, the initial common ancestor branches off to the giraffe and the bat, right? They share another common ancestor between them. But if you go to the right, now this new common ancestor that leads to the turtle and all of the rest of the taxa is not included in the one with the bat and the giraffe. What this shows us is that the derived characters that arrive after the splitting off of two main taxa will lead to analogous traits being arrived at. So this is convergent evolution. The hawk arrived with birds having flight. Bats have evolved flight, but they did not share a common ancestor that had flight. In fact, the dinosaurs and the birds split and they shared flight, but the bat evolved the trait of flight completely independently. So it's an analogous event, an analogous characteristic, and we call that convergent evolution, right? These traits are called homoplasy. The next thing we really want to look at is the outgroup. Whenever you have a phylogenetic tree or a cladogram, You have an in group, which is like the group you're focused on. What are we looking at? What are we trying to show the evolutionary history of? Or the what traits arose within which population? These are the in group. The out group is like a comparison organism. So it is related to these other organisms, but it's more distantly related. So we'll have this one clade from the node that's red, and that shared history of A and B, and then the A taxon and the B taxon, and that shared ancestry is what we're looking at. Well, C came from the original primitive ancestor, that common ancestor between A, B, and C. But C is the outgroup because we're not looking at those characteristics. And so it's giving us like a time frame or an organismal evolutionary frame of reference for what we're looking at as well. So question, which organism indicates the outgroup? Which organism will indicate the outgroup? In this cladogram, we see the lamprey as the outgroup because all other organisms have jaws. We know we read it that way because the last one's no tail. And if we read it from right to left, that would mean none of the organisms to the left would have a tail, but they all do. So we're reading from left to right. We see that the lamprey is the outgroup. And then the first synapomorphy or shared derived character we get is jaws, right? Which characteristics does the lizard exhibit? So the lizard's toward the middle, and we're looking at the lizard and what characteristics it has. So it exhibits everything to the left of it. So the lizard has jaws, the lizard has lungs, and the lizard has dry skin, but it does not have hair, and it certainly has a tail, right? So which organism is the oldest? Again, the ancestral organisms are to the left. So for our purpose here, the lamprey is the ancestral or primitive organism in this cladogram. How do we know? Because it's the furthest to the left, and so it is showing the ancestral node, that primitive original node. Everything to the right came after in evolutionary terms. The weird thing about cladistics and cladograms is that they can be rearranged. So because they're based solely on morphology, there's multiple ways to put these things together. We can look at this and think, well, what other morphological characteristics do we see? What phenotypes are there, right? Well, we know they have a tail. Well, the tiger, lizard, salamander, shark, and lamprey are all carnivorous. So we could have had an herbivore and then evolved carnivorism, if you will. And then the lamprey is hematophagous, and so it sucks blood, right? And so we could go to non-hematophagous, and that would give us the shark, the salamander, the lizard, and the tiger left. We could look at the chambers of the heart. So lamprey and sharks have two-chambered hearts, and salamanders and lizards have three-chambered hearts. And then, well, a salamander has kind of like a 2.5 chambered heart. It has kind of a porous valve or wall between its atrial, its two atria, or its one atria. And then the tiger and the gorilla have four-chambered hearts. We could look at teeth, right? Well, they all have teeth, so that's kind of useless. But the lamprey has teeth going all the way down kind of its throat. We could look at what's poisonous. Salamanders are poisonous if you lick them, and lampreys are poisonous if you eat them. We could look at claws. So salamanders, lizards, tigers, and gorillas have claws. Paired limbs, lampreys don't have limbs. So sharks have a pair of limbs, where salamanders, lizards, tigers, and gorillas have two pair of limbs. Ectothermic, so lizard, salamander, shark, and lamprey are ectothermic, right? Where tigers and gorillas are endothermic. So we can look at binocular vision versus parietal vision. We can look at whether it has eyelids or not, or ear flaps, ear coverings or not, if it has fins, if the ears are on top of the head or not, right? All these characteristics could be used to make a cladogram. It doesn't only have to be these few. And that's why it's very difficult to only use cladistics to determine evolutionary trends, because you could rearrange this in many different ways. So we need to be careful. But when we're constructing cladograms, we do want to have a way to structure them. One of the easy things when you have a larger group of organisms that you're looking at is to make a table, and you list the characteristics of the organisms that you see, and then you identify, you identify which organisms have each of the characteristics. So if you had a shark, a bullfrog, a kangaroo, and a human, the vertebrates, well, they're all vertebrates. Next, 2 pairs of limbs. So sharks only have 1 pair. Bullfrogs, kangaroos, and humans each have 2 pairs. Mammary glands, well, only kangaroos and humans. Placental, well, kangaroos are not placental, they're marsupial, so only humans. So now we could see when we arrange our cladogram, the thing with the least would be the most ancestral, the thing with the most would be the most modern. Okay, if we look at the next one, frog, rodent, lizard, gorilla, fish, and bird, you can see how you check off each of the columns with what things have to make an effort to determine the ancestry. Now, when you look, you can see that eggs in the shell and hair or fur have 2 organisms in each column. But if you count across, the frog only has 2 checks. The fish has 1 check, right? Rodents have 3 checks. Birds have 4 checks. Lizards have 4 checks. Gorillas have 4 checks. So when you're looking at this, you have to determine in what order you're going to place things. This particular trait or set of traits led to this cladogram. So this is the one we were looking at with the lamprey, the shark, salamander, lizard, tiger, gorilla, but then it added humans. And so it's looking at bipedalism as well. Amniotic membranes, hairs, tails, things like that. So when we look at our columns, we can see the lamprey is the oldest. It has none of the characteristics, so it's the common ancestor. Then we would look at the shark because it only has 1 synapomorphy. So when jaws evolved, now we get the shark. Then it looks like lungs evolved and we get the salamander. Then amniotic membranes evolved and we get a lizard. Then we get hair. Now we have the tiger. We get no tail, and there's the gorilla, and finally bipedalism, and there's a human. So what does this show us? It shows us that the salamander had jaws and lungs, but it did not have hair or a tail, right? Well, it does have a tail. It does not have no tail, sorry, hair or no tail. But it also shows us the lamprey does not have any of those characteristics. It is the oldest, where the human is the youngest. So let's take a look at our own little chart of little dragons, we'll call them. When we look at the morphological traits in the dragons, we can see some have ears and some have tails and some have spikies. Some have legs and arms, some have wings, right? Some of the other things, some walk on 2 feet, looks like some walk on 4 feet. That dark blue and green one on the end has like a little tip on its tail. It looks like the red one has a pretty flat snout. Maybe even that light blue one, it might have a flat snout. The light blue one has a white snout, or it's 2-toned. I guess that red one with the orange wings could be 2-toned, and maybe that green one might have some white on its belly, and the blue and green one in the end. You can see that 3 of them have just black eyes, right? So they're kind of like just the pupil, where the red one has a pupil and the sclera. And then that blue and green dragon on the end has an iris, a sclera, and a pupil. Like, wow, we're getting crazy with the depictions of these dragons, right? So we want to order these by novel trait. We don't need to use 100 traits. We'll just choose a couple. And so the first ones we'll look at are ears, tails, horns, limbs, spikes, and wings. So we're looking at these organisms and we need to identify which characters go to each drawing. And it looks like the first one has ears, the pink guy, but none of the other ones look like they actually have ear flaps or ears, right? The next 4 have a tail, but that first one, it does not look like he has a tail. Only one of them has horns, right? The guy on the end. And then all of them have 4 limbs. it looks like 3 of them have spikes and 2 of them have the wings. So when we look at this, we can see that there's some trends, some things that they all have, some things that only one has, and now we have to decide what order we're going to put them in. So if we list the things that they all have in common, we know that that's the first synapomorphy we see, the one that the ancestral organism will have in common with the rest of the taxa. So forelimbs would be the thing that arose first. Then comes the tail, because 4 people share it, which means that the pink dragon must be the primary or primitive organism that started this clade. So we have this organism. They must have lost ear flaps because I don't see any ear flaps after that. And forelimbs came, right? And then we see the tail arise. And then we would see spikes come. Then we would see wings evolve and then the horns. And so this is what our cladogram would look like. They have 4 limbs, then comes the tail. Here we go with spikes. Then we see the synapomorphy of wings and finally of horns. And that's how we arrive at our various taxa. We could have used these other categories like we talked about before, right? It looks like 4 of them might exhibit bipedalism. So there's other ways to break these classifications up that still might be correct. But often the simplest, most direct form is usually the one that they use. At the end of this video, students should be able to identify how to analyze phylogenetic trees or cladograms, and should be able to differentiate between the evolutionary relationships shown within a cladogram.